At exactly midnight on August 1st, 2025, while most of the world was still fast asleep, a brief news flash from Washington tore through the quiet night like a bolt of lightning. President Donald Trump had just signed a new executive order, raising tariffs on Canadian imports from 25% to 35%. Just one signature, just one number. Yet instantly, it sent shockwaves from the White House down to every street, every cafe in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. It was a move that, on the surface, seemed typical of Trump, a man who had often wielded tariffs as political weapons, to bargain, to apply pressure, to flex America's might. But this time, that familiar move came with a very different tone. This time, it ignited an unprecedented crisis between two nations long regarded as sharing the most peaceful border in the world. Trump made no effort to hide his pride. On Truth Social, he hailed it as a bold step to protect American workers, as if it were just another play out of his well-worn political playbook. To him, tariffs were no different from a social media post. Easy to write, easy to delete, easy to boast about. But across the border, no one was laughing. As the clock ticked into the new day, Canada realized it was standing at a crossroads. Either endure this, as it had so many times before, or this time, rewrite the rules of the game. That midnight signature wasn't just an administrative gesture. It was more like a violent knock on the door, forcing the northern neighbor out of its familiar chair and face a critical question. Would Canada continue playing the role of the polite neighbor, letting the U.S. dictate its economic fate, or step into the light with an unprecedented response? In that moment, the air in Ottawa was thick with silence. No pounding fists, no fiery speeches. Instead, there were urgent phone calls, closed-door meetings, and a flurry of texts between ministers and economic advisors. Everyone understood. Retaliating with matching tariffs would only fuel an escalating spiral. Canada needed a different path, quieter, smarter, and far more devastating. And so, while Washington basked in the illusion of a tariff victory, Ottawa was quietly preparing its own special counterstrike. A strike without gunfire, yet powerful enough to shake the foundations of the American economy. They called it the nuclear option, Canada's ultimate move. Canada didn't choose the familiar path of tit-for-tat retaliation, because everyone understood that in a head-on tariff war, the smaller economy is usually the one that bleeds most. Instead, Ottawa played an unexpected card, restructuring its entire economic relationship with the U.S. in just a matter of days. No loud slogans, no provocative tweets, just quiet, calculated moves that left Washington stunned. Canada slashed key trade incentives and tightened the flow of travelers and goods crossing south. The caravans of snowbirds, those familiar retirees who drive down to Florida each winter to escape the cold, vanished overnight. Canadian businesses were encouraged to seek new partners in Europe, Asia, and South America. Domestic trade associations launched campaigns to promote buying local while subtly tightening capital controls to stem the flow of money heading across the border. The metaphor that quickly took hold was the lawnmower. Where once Canada had relied on the U.S. to mow the lawn, meaning they paid for the service and accepted dependency, they now decided to buy their own mower and do it themselves. This wasn't just a trade adjustment, it was a political statement. Canada was ready to live without Washington's helping hand. The impact came faster than anyone expected. Seemingly ordinary items like a cozy hoodie or a morning coffee suddenly became vivid reminders of Canada's counterstrike. As supply lines tightened, prices for textiles, lumber, and processed foods spiked across supermarkets in the northern U.S. Consumers in Michigan, New York, and Ohio were shocked to see their grocery bills jump overnight. Further south, states like Florida that relied heavily on Canadian tourists began reporting a wave of empty hotels and quiet restaurants. Without the snowbirds, entire local economies lost their heartbeat. At first, Washington didn't fully grasp the depth of the move. To Trump, it was just another political bargaining chip. But to Ottawa, it was a battle for survival. And Canada's silence turned out to be far more unnerving than any fiery statement. Under Carney's leadership, the Canadian government turned the tariff shock into an opportunity, forcing businesses and citizens alike to break old habits and awaken a spirit of self-reliance. It all happened quietly, but the consequences echoed far and wide. And then, just weeks later, the aftershocks began spreading. not just at the border crossings or grocery aisles, but all the way to Main Street, where working-class Americans lived paycheck to paycheck, and to Wall Street, the most powerful financial hub on Earth. That's when Washington finally understood Canada's silent strike had become a true economic earthquake. From the small border towns where shops once bustling with Canadian customers now sat eerily quiet, to the luxury resorts of Florida suddenly devoid of their northern migratory birds, America began to feel the tremors. Ordinary Americans who had rarely paid attention to tariff policies or trade negotiations were now seeing the impact directly on their daily receipts. A cup of coffee cost more than it did yesterday. A winter hoodie had become a luxury, and a once routine trip to Canada was now tangled in red tape. Tariffs, once just dry numbers buried in political reports, had entered everyday life as a heavy, tangible burden. American businesses weren't faring any better. Ford was forced to recalculate its production costs as parts and raw materials from Canada stalled. Multi-billion-dollar losses began appearing in quarterly reports. Procter & Gamble, the consumer goods giant, faced a hard choice: either accept a hit to profits or raise prices on soap, shampoo, detergent, everyday essentials in nearly every American home. And with each price hike, a ripple spread touching kitchens, bathrooms, and households across the nation, making it undeniably clear the trade war was no longer just a Washington headline. On Wall Street, where every economic shockwave is magnified, concern quickly turned into chaos. Stocks of companies reliant on Canadian supply chains plummeted. Investment funds began pulling out. The markets trembled. The Dow Jones and S&P 500 lit up in red, warning the world that a silent crisis was forming at the heart of the American economy. Economic analysts no longer spoke of challenges or temporary setbacks. Instead, they began using a far more chilling phrase: crisis of confidence. What made this shockwave so unique was its source. The world was used to hearing threats from Beijing or Moscow, but no one expected the most devastating blow to come from Ottawa, the neighbor long seen as the gentlest of allies. With a silent, calculated response strategy, Canada had left America more confused than any adversary ever had. And at the center of this geopolitical quake, one name began to emerge as the architect: Mark Carney. He didn't rally crowds, he didn't retaliate with fiery speeches. Carney chose a different path, a long game, one that only those with a deep understanding of global dynamics would dare to play. From the chaos of Main Street to the shockwaves hitting Wall Street, Canada was ready to flip the board. And the one guiding that strategy was the new Prime Minister, a man already well acquainted with battles fought on the world's biggest financial stages. Mark Carney emerged in the midst of the chaos like a calm chess player, making steady, deliberate moves while his opponents stumbled. A former governor of both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, Carney was no stranger to crises. People still called him the architect of 2008, the man who helped pull the global financial system back from the edge of collapse. And now, as Prime Minister, he brought that same composure into a brutal trade war with the United States. Carney didn't rally people to oppose America. He didn't cast himself as an antagonist in the media. Instead, he quietly redrew Canada's economic boundaries. Within just 12 months, the percentage of Canadian exporting to the U.S. dropped from 78% to 68%, a figure that stunned observers around the world. Behind it were a flurry of new trade agreements signed with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Mexico. Canada no longer put all its eggs in the American basket. Instead, it spread out risk, seized new opportunities, and positioned itself as an indispensable link in the global supply chain. For Carney, every step was a silent checkmate. He knew the U.S. might dominate in size, but it couldn't forever control the flow of global trade. By opening markets and deepening multilateral ties, Canada wasn't just shielding itself from tariffs, it was laying the foundation for a new era, a post-America phase in its development strategy. Liquefied natural gas contracts with Japan, lumber and agricultural export deals with Europe, and green energy projects with Australia began to sketch out a bold new horizon for the Canadian economy. In the eyes of the international community, Carney was no longer just a reactive prime minister. He became a visionary. He offered a clear perspective. Canada was not a satellite of Washington, but a mature middle power with the resolve to shape its own rules. It led many to compare him to historical figures who had reshaped the global order, not with weapons, but with intellect. Yet, Carney's most decisive move didn't lie in trade diplomacy or headline-grabbing economic deals. He understood that Canada possessed another treasure, one that could become a true strategic lever on the global chessboard: its minerals. In a world hungry for clean energy, electric vehicle batteries, and advanced technology, Canada's vast underground reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, and rare earth elements were nothing short of geopolitical trump cards. And as Carney began tapping into that geopolitical treasure, the game moved beyond trade. It opened up a new arena, broader, fiercer, and far more consequential. Canada has long been known as the land of pine forests, shimmering lakes, and endless wheat fields. But beneath that seemingly tranquil crust of rock and soil lies a treasure the modern world craves more than ever: strategic minerals. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, rare earths, names that may sound dry, but they are the lifeblood of tomorrow's industries. Every smartphone, every missile, every solar panel or electric vehicle depends on them. And in the global race toward energy transition, Canada suddenly holds something many superpowers don't: a safe, stable supply, right next door to the United States. Carney understood that this value wasn't merely economic, it was geopolitical. In the past, most of Canada's mineral output was exported in raw form, but now the government made a bold pivot. Ottawa poured investment into deep processing, building state-of-the-art refining facilities, not just to sell ore, but to sell high-value finished materials. This was no longer the domain of scattered mining companies. It had become a national strategy backed and steered by the state. The result? A double advantage. On one hand, it helped reduce the world's dependence on China, which currently dominates the global supply of rare earths and EV batteries. On the other, it transformed Canada into an irreplaceable partner, one that major economies now had no choice but to court as a safe alternative. Meanwhile, the US, despite being geographically closest, turned its back at the very moment it should have drawn closer. That contradiction left American tech and industrial giants in a bind. They needed these materials to keep production going, but White House policy had just cut off their safest, shortest supply route. Ironically, Beijing stood to gain. As tensions flared between Washington and Ottawa, many US companies were forced to look east toward China to find substitutes, unwittingly fueling the very rival they sought to contain. The more the US applied pressure, the more it pushed itself away from the treasure lying right at its doorstep. Meanwhile, far from growing weaker, Canada only gained confidence. For the first time in its history, it held a trump card of truly global scale. But Carney knew minerals, oil, or timber were only part of the equation. To win the long game, Canada would need a weapon even sharper, one not buried underground, not reflected in trade charts, but woven deep into the hearts and habits of its people. That weapon was the silent strength of public psychology. And so, from gleaming mineral mines, Carney stepped onto a different battlefield: the war of silence. There were no mass protests in the streets, no banners screaming "Down with America," no thunderous declarations blasted across the media. Canada's response unfolded in silence. A silence that was deliberate, powerful, and unwavering. Rather than noise, they chose to make every citizen a quiet warrior in an economic battle. The Buy Canadian campaign spread across cities and countryside alike, not through top-down orders, but through grassroots will. People saw buying a bag of detergent, a car, or even a carton of milk made in Canada as a patriotic act, a vote against pressure from the South. This kind of strength couldn't be measured in instant metrics, but it seeped in, steadily and resolutely, more effective than any political slogan. Crowded supermarkets where shoppers eagerly reached for local goods, social media posts rallying support for Canadian businesses, together they built an undercurrent that was vast and unstoppable. Canada had found a way to turn frustration into motivation and anger into community strength. If Trump used noise to apply pressure, Carney used silence to sow belief. And that silence, paradoxically, became the heaviest blow of all. Because once a collective mindset is awakened, it doesn't retreat with a single executive order or one angry tweet. It made the US market harder to access and transformed Canada into a self-reliant, resilient force. As internal confidence grew, so did external strength, leaving Washington increasingly cornered in a game it had started. But while America struggled to grasp Canada's calm yet unyielding posture, another paradox was unfolding. Across the Pacific, Beijing quietly seized the moment. When Trump announced a 90-day ceasefire deal with China, new trade doors swung open almost immediately. China rushed to sign a flurry of zero-tariff agreements with African and Asian nations, steadily expanding its sphere of influence. As Washington weakened its own alliances, Beijing capitalized, turning America's stalemate with Canada into a golden opportunity to bolster its global standing. And so, from a silent war in Ottawa, the larger chessboard emerged, with a clear winner beginning to take shape: China. While America was still grappling with Canada's unexpected counterstrike, the White House made a sudden and controversial move: a 90-day trade truce with China. Trump hailed it as a tactical victory, a pause to show he could control Beijing. But in reality, the opposite was unfolding. As Washington poured its energy into managing Ottawa, Beijing quietly seized every passing moment to expand its global reach. In just a few short weeks, China signed a wave of zero-tariff agreements with countries across Africa and Asia. Railways, ports, and industrial zones, hallmarks of the Belt and Road Initiative, suddenly surged with renewed momentum. Beijing wasn't just offering trade deals, it was handing out tickets to a rapidly growing global network. Meanwhile, Washington was weakening its own influence. Its harsh tariff policy against Canada sowed doubt among allies worldwide. If even a peaceful neighbor like Ottawa could be treated this way, who could truly count on America to honor its long-term commitments? Trump's misstep wasn't just about the 35% tariff. It was the message it sent. Rather than focusing on its greatest strategic rival, the US had opened up a new front against its closest ally. It was like shooting itself in the foot, stretching its forces thin while giving its opponent free rein to solidify power. Canada didn't crumble. In fact, it emerged stronger. And China? It turned America's gridlock into a springboard for asserting itself as the new center of global trade. The world watched and saw the paradox clearly. Washington, despite its vast economic power, was isolating itself through rash decisions. Meanwhile, Beijing, calculating and patient, chose the perfect moment to take a giant leap forward. And from this standoff on the world's most peaceful border, America slowly began to realize it hadn't just lost a trade dispute, it had lost its grip on the global chessboard. In the end, after all the upheaval, it became clear that this was never just about tariffs. It was a battle of vision, of resolve, and of strategy. A single stroke of a pen in the dead of night cost the United States far more than it imagined, while Canada, once viewed as the quiet neighbor, rose to become a strategic player, turning challenge into opportunity. Ottawa proved that soft power, economic restructuring, and social cohesion can be just as formidable as tanks or missiles. The lesson for Washington was unmistakable. To underestimate your allies is to shoot yourself in the foot. A decision that seemed minor in the moment can unravel decades of trust. In this new era of geopolitics, strength isn't just about military might or GDP size. It lies in adaptability, perseverance, and the art of inspiring belief among your people. The lesson for the rest of the world is equally profound. Sometimes it doesn't take a thunderous explosion to reshape the global order, just a wise strategy and quiet, relentless patience. The story between the US and Canada reminds us that in trade wars, bullets aren't always necessary. A pen, a policy, or a collective societal choice can unleash waves powerful enough to shake the world. And perhaps this is only the beginning of a new era, one where middle powers like Canada step onto the global stage with greater weight, forcing the traditional superpowers to take a hard look in the mirror. If you have thoughts on this analysis, leave a comment below and let's continue the conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth insights as we explore the forces reshaping our world today.